Let me first of all thank David for having persevered and developed the Restoration Weekend into an extraordinary event, and all the other things you're doing in so many different places. You, like Ron Silver, have the courage to be in the heart of the other team's camp and to stand firmly for what you believe to be true, and you've really made a difference for America. And Clifton and I are thrilled to be here with you. I believe we're here at a remarkable time. And I do think it's helpful to put this in context. Many of you have been active for many years, and you've been involved in winning fights and you've been involved in losing fights. I've helped twice develop very large campaigns. In 1979, 1980, working with Bill Brock at the National Committee and as the chair of the Planning Committee of the Congressional Campaign Committee, we designed the first ever Capitol Steps event, and we designed a campaign which ultimately won control of the Senate by a margin of 75,000 votes in 6 states. And nobody expected 3 weeks out that we'd win the Senate, and in fact nobody expected the weekend before the election we'd win the Senate. But we had deliberately designed a sweep strategy. We gained 33 seats in the House. And I believe that both Ed Royce and Michelle Bachmann, who are here today, are going to end up being chairs probably in January of 2011. And I think and I say this as somebody who all through the summer of 1980 thought Mac Mattingly could beat Senator Herman Talmadge, and as somebody who all through 93 and 94 kept telling people that we did have a chance to win. Now, I want to talk to you about what it will take to win, and I want to talk to you about it at a much deeper level than we've been through. And I think this is part of why you have today a Tea Party movement, is because we haven't been getting straight talk out of our politicians, and people have been dancing past things they don't want to talk about, and we have been trying to compromise the uncompromisable. Now, I think it's important to understand that the 2004 election was a wasted opportunity. I wrote a paper that year, you can get at newt.org, in which I outlined that in 57 issues, John Kerry was, on average, in a 77 to 17 minority. Remember, John Kerry was to the left of Teddy Kennedy. John Kerry was a setup for the next great George McGovern, Walter Mondale moment of absolute annihilation of the left. And you couldn't get the Bush team to pay attention, because they were determined to run a base mobilization, narrow margin victory, focusing on crushing Kerry as a person. Largely, I think, because they were so uncomfortable with ideas. They then couldn't recognize that a president who doesn't veto guarantees stupid spending. It is impossible for the Congress to police itself. It's only been done one time in modern history for 4 years, and I personally did it. In the 4 years I was Speaker, we had let me just finish this, because people don't understand this. In the 4 years I was Speaker, total federal spending, including the entitlements, went up 2.94% a year. That is the lowest rate since Calvin Coolidge. In the absence of a remarkably powerful Speaker, and you couldn't sustain it. Part of the reason I ended up not being Speaker is I kept saying no to a lot of people. In the absence of a Speaker that strong, you have to have a president who vetoes bills. And to have a deal that says you can pass anything no matter how stupid, and I'll sign it. And then remember the second half of the deal, which is Congress didn't do its investigative work, and they basically said you can have a bureaucracy of unbelievable incompetence and we won't expose it. After all, we're on the same team. The big spending, bad governing, bureaucratic team. Well, the average American looked up and said, if I want to get that kind of behavior, let's get Democrats. They're at least happy doing it. So in 2005, Bush goes to New Orleans after 5 days of watching this country go through an agony on television, and he says, Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. Now, he never recovered from that. Because the average American looked up and said, if he doesn't understand New Orleans is a disaster, and he doesn't understand this guy's incompetent, what does that tell me about Baghdad? What does that tell me about everything else that's going on? So in 2006, the country tried to send a signal. We were 0 for 6 in close Senate races. Many of you gave tons of money. I want to tell you up front, Money spent without purpose in a campaign without an argument is a waste of money. When you're 0 for 6 in close Senate races, it is not a personality problem. It's a fundamental repudiation. We lost the House. We lost, and I started saying this, by the way, in January of 2006. I mean, go back and Google it. Because I said, if you're not a reform party and you're not dominating October with reform, you are going to get crushed. So now you come to 2008. And people don't realize this, but because of American solutions, and because we picked up the theme of drill here, drill now, pay less, and because Sean Hannity helped us and we got 1,500,000 signatures in 6 weeks, and the House Republicans took it up brilliantly. The Senate Republicans were confused as usual. But the House Republicans picked it up brilliantly, and the House Republicans waged a campaign in August that was fabulous. And the result was, the week before Wall Street collapsed, the Republicans were ahead by 5 points in the generic ballot, and McCain was up by 3, because we were winning an argument. We weren't pitting our guy against their guy, we were pitting our vision of the world against their vision of the world. We will always win if we have the courage to do that. And then in 2008, the Republicans lost an election in one of the great, I believe, ironic moments in American history. The Democrats totally misunderstood the election. The 2006 and 2008 elections are performance elections. We were fired for not performing. They were not values elections. They were not realignment elections. A leading Democrat consultant said the other day, the great crisis for the Democratic Party is that they don't understand their first actual election is coming up in 2010. They were the heirs of the Republican failure. My daughter Jackie Cushman writes a weekly column and wrote about 2 months ago, we were told we were voting for change you can believe in, and we found we were voting for somebody who wanted to change what we believe. And that's what came together. Now here's my proposition for all of you to think about and organize yourself for the next 3 years on. The combination of Obama, Pelosi, and Reid is creating a decisive moment in American history that may be the most decisive since the 1850s. Because they are making so vividly clear, and I just got from David his newest little book on, which is exactly right. In fact, I have a copy of Alinsky's book on my desk right now for the same reason. I mean, what we're going to discover is that you have the most radical president in American history, with the most radical Speaker of the House, with a total opportunist as Senate Majority Leader. Harry Reid's not particularly radical. He's just happy to be with whatever group is in charge. And what's the result? The country has now looked up and said, let me get this straight. We're at 10.2% unemployment going up. The larger unemployment number is 17.5 if you count people who've quit looking and people who are marginally employed. In California, my guess is your larger unemployment number is 20, every fifth person. The Chinese have $2 trillion in debt, and Obama wants to spend rapidly enough that they'll have $4 trillion by the end of 8 years. We have no national energy policy, so we rely on bowing to a Saudi king to get energy and hugging a Venezuelan dictator. We have a foreign policy of total weakness. We have an attorney general who believes in protecting terrorists rather than Americans. We have a system so confused that the chief of staff of the Army thought one of the greatest casualties at Fort Hood could be diversity. I thought the greatest casualties at Fort Hood were Americans who lost their lives in a war, serving their country, being attacked by a terrorist. I don't think it's confusing. And the message I want to bring to you today is, this is a moment to quit worrying about them. We know who they are. We know how bad they are. We know how much damage they would like to do. This is the moment to figure out what the replacement is. And I want to argue that the purpose of 2010 and 2012 should be very straightforward. That this should be the greatest replacement campaign probably since Andrew Jackson in 1828. And it should be designed as a replacement campaign. And we should be very clear from day one. We're not interested in reforming the left. We're not interested in compromising with the left. We're not interested in understanding the left. We are interested in replacing the left. Now, having helped design 3 relatively successful campaigns, 1980, 1988, when we were behind, remember, George H.W. Bush was behind Dukakis by 19 points in May. And we decided the only way to win was make it a values campaign, not a personality campaign. And we switched actually 27% of the country between May and November. And then 1994, which had the largest one-party increase in turnout in American history. 9 million additional voters because of a conscious and disciplined, and Ed will remember because he was there and he was part of it. It was a disciplined, direct, systematic campaign that was designed to send a positive message to the Perot voters to get them to turn out. So what is our message? I believe our message has to be, among ourselves internally, that we have an opportunity of such enormous proportions that we have to go out, I believe, and undertake 3 steps, and only 3. First, we have to design an argument so large that when we win it, we crush the left. I am totally opposed to base mobilization, narrow focus campaigns. I believe you want to set up fights where you're at 80 or 90% and they're at 10 or 12%, and you want to just break them. And you want to do it so that when the media is done lying about you and your own team, which will be relatively amateurish and relatively confused, is done being confused, you still are ahead by 65-35. That's a very, go back and look at the contract. Every item in the contract was 70% or better. Why? Because we wanted candidates who'd never run before to be on local talk radio saying things cleverly like, I am for welfare reform. That was a 92% issue. So the person driving down the road goes, oh good, I am too. And then we want them to memorize key phrases like, I think we should have a balanced budget, which was an 88% issue. And people would say, oh yes, I am too. And I learned this lesson in a variety of ways. I'm not going to go into it today because of time, but there were years of my trying to understand, how do teams win? Whether it's the American Army, where I'm the longest serving teacher in the senior military, or it's studying the football coach in Carrollton, Georgia, who had the best record in the state of Georgia. And he had a simple model. The only person in Georgia who ran a single wing. He said nobody in high school could ever learn how to defense against a single wing in 1 week, and it gave all 11 people something to do. He said, if I get all 11 to do a little bit, they're going to beat a team that has to rely on a quarterback and an end. Now, this may seem obvious to you, but we designed the '94 campaign very directly and very simply. We then were faced with a greater challenge. No Republican had been reelected since 1928 as a majority. And in 1996, with a relatively weak Republican candidate against an incumbent Democratic president, we had to get reelected. It was the hardest single campaign we fought. And we went back and did the same thing. We designed a fight over Medicare. We trained our own team how to win the fight. We spent a year doing it. We kept AARP totally off balance and neutral. And the result was, for the first time since 1928, we got reelected. So the first thing we want to do is win the argument. I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing we want to do is flood the election with candidates. And I have a very simple, direct injunction to all of you. There are 513,000 elected offices in the United States, from school board to city council to county commission to state legislature to governor to Congress to the presidency. Fill them all. If it's a district which you are absolutely 100% convinced no Republican can win, recruit a moderate Democrat. You can go out with a very simple model. We're going to define a secular socialist left wing. And I'm going to say to everybody, and this will get me in some trouble, I'm sure, on talk radio, but I'm going to say to everybody who's not for a secular socialist left wing, help us win an election. And let me give you the specific example. 64% of California voted against more taxes and more spending in May. 64%. Every congressional district voted no. Pelosi's district was 51% no. Now you have to ask yourself a tough question. Would you be willing to elect a Republican governor in California with 64%, knowing that you would have carried San Francisco? Or do you have to go figure out a way to go and infuriate San Francisco, so now you only win by 60? And then why don't we throw in a way to infuriate Los Angeles? So now you're down to 55. And then why don't we make sure that we really, truly irritate Latinos? So now you're down to 49. This is going to be a real challenge for the conservative movement. You can govern as a center-right majority, and you can bring together an amazing range of people, and we can break Pelosi, and we can break Reid, and we can replace Obama, and he can be a one-term president exactly like Jimmy Carter, but it requires building a national majority. Or we can feel really good and really narrow and decide, boy, are we virtuous? I don't think if that happens, Pelosi is Speaker for life, and Obama will get reelected. I think it's that simple. So let's pick fights that are huge but fit conservative values. I mean, nobody's ever looked at the Contract with America and said it wasn't conservative. But it was all based on big fights on big themes. The third thing you have to do, which both Reagan and Thatcher, and to some extent myself, all three of us failed to do. You have to build a program deep enough that when people get elected, they know what they're going to do from the first day, or they get absorbed by the old order. So we're going to develop a 4P program over the next year and a half. If we had total control in January of 13 at every level, school board, county commission, city council, what policies would we implement? What processes would we implement? What personnel could actually get the job done? And how do you get public support for it so you can sustain it? Because I don't want us to win one time and then get crushed because people didn't understand what we're doing. So if you have that happen, let me go back to the argument, because I think the first phase is to win the argument. I'm going to give you 3 questions that I believe are going to define America for a generation. And they're not complicated questions. Who are we? What does it take to compete successfully with China and India economically? What threatens us, and how do we keep America safe? Those are the 3 questions. And the difference between the secular socialist left and the rest of us is so startling that when you get to this level of basic values, we are a 70, 80, or 90% country, and they're in somewhere between a 9 and 15% minority. But you've got to get to these values. First one, who are we? My personal belief is we are historically a people endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I am prepared to polarize the country on that issue. And let me explain why. First of all, as compared to the secular socialist model, the American model, this isn't a political document, remember, not a theological document, that is in the Declaration of Independence. You can see it at the National Archive. Clifton and I just published a new version of Rediscovering God in America with her photos, and you can actually see all this. You can see it in our movie, Rediscovering God in America. I mean, I'm not making any of this up, right? It is a fact that our founding fathers wrote a document in politics and said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, which means each one of you is sovereign. We are the only nation in history where you, the citizen, are sovereign and you loan power to the state. Inalienable. No judge, no president, no bureaucrat can get between you and the sovereignty God has given you. This is a core argument at the Nature of America. It's the core reason that the health bill is crazy. Page 26 of the House Health Bill. The Secretary of Health and Human Services can reduce benefits, raise premiums, and establish waiting lists for people in high-risk pools if they don't have enough money. Singularly, by herself, as a pro-abortion, very left-wing Democrat, the current secretary could raise the premiums, reduce the benefits, and establish waiting lists. Which is why the mammogram decision this week was timed perfectly. You start going to global budgeting, it says, if you're in your 40s and die, at least it was statistically useful to balancing the budget. Now that is a grotesque, fundamental violation, which is why the Pelosi bill, which 220 Democrats should be made to defend for the next year, every day. They voted yes for a bill which fundamentally violates the Declaration of Independence. There's a second part to that. We're endowed with the right to pursue happiness. Happiness in the Scottish Enlightenment meant virtue and wisdom. And Jefferson took the phrase directly from the Scottish Enlightenment. Actually, I've seen the book, they underlined the phrase. Pursue. Notice the core idea. It's an active verb. Does not establish the right to sue if you're unhappy. Does not establish an entitlement to happiness. Does not establish the notion of a federal department of happiness or happiness stamps for those who are without happiness. Does not create the right to redistribute happiness. And so and by the way, the right to pursue was implicit in Captain John Smith in the very first summer saying in Jamestown in 1607, if you don't work, you won't eat. And he didn't say it to the poor, he said it to the aristocrats. America has been for 400 years a country of a work ethic, a country which believed in savings, a country which believed in investing, and a country which at its core fundamentally repudiates the idea that some group of politicians ought to decide an appropriate level of income and ought to decide how to take from one group to give to another for political purposes. Second, what do we have to do to compete successfully with China and India? I have a very simple model. My two grandchildren, Cliff and I, are going to go and see Maggie dance at the at the Fox Theater in the Nutcracker Suite. Any of you who'd like to get tickets, if you'll see us, we'll be glad to allow you to watch her. We have you come to us and watch Maggie with us. But Maggie's 10, Robert's 8. One of my major goals in my remaining years as a citizen is to try to ensure that our country is reformed adequately, that they will be in the most prosperous, most productive, most creative country in the world, because if they're not, they won't be able to sustain the national security system necessary for their freedom. And so I have a very simple test. I want to again polarize the country in a very simple test question. Do you believe we are better off to appease the Chinese and decay gracefully while the Chinese become the dominant power on the planet? Or do you think we should roll up our sleeves, do what it takes, get our act together, and compete successfully so we remain the most prosperous and strongest country on the planet? And that's a fundamental choice. But if you're serious, if you do a business case study and you look at China and India, if you are serious about us remaining the most creative and most productive country in the world, you have to end up fundamentally rethinking litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure. And unless you do all those, you're not going to be able to succeed. I did 2 novels on World War II, Pearl Harbor and Days of Infamy. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack us at Pearl Harbor. August 1945, the Japanese surrender. 44 months. In 3 years and 8 months, we mobilized 15,500,000 people in uniform. We built the B-17, B-24, B-29. We built 4 cities and 29 facilities for the atomic bomb. We would build a 2-ocean navy. We sweep across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, defeat Germany, while simultaneously sweeping across the Pacific. 44 months. It recently took us 23 years to add a 5th runway to the Atlanta airport. The FAA broke down 2 days ago because their procurement system is so incompetent and so cumbersome, they cannot replace the computer system that is collapsing. 8 years after 9/11, we have not rebuilt the World Trade Center. In World War II, we would have taken exactly the same blueprint, rebuilt exactly the same buildings, done it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, put them back up in less than a year, to say to the planet, you can hit us, but you can't keep us down. I spent 8 years in the Bush administration with tremendous help from Vice President Cheney and others, having a chance to go as an advisor in the executive branch, having spent 20 years in the legislative branch. This system is broken, and you have to think about replacement, not reform. And the first fight I'd pick there on the question of competing is simple. By the way, this is a number that drives me crazy about the Republican Party. In January, CBS News reported, at the peak of Obamaism, when business was at its lowest point of respect, that when asked the question, which do you think is a better way of creating jobs? Cutting business taxes, using the term business, cutting business taxes, or increasing government spending. It was 59-21. I mean, the fact that the Republicans in the House and Senate did not create a business tax cut of $787 billion and said, look, if you're determined to spend $787 billion, we have a model. That would have put you at a reasonably high number of people with an interest in it. We tested recently with Dave Winston, and by the way, it's now 62-21. And nobody believes, I mean, the country increasingly believes the stimulus is a waste of money and just politician payoff. So at American Solutions, we're developing, because we're going to have a big fight over the economy starting in January. They're going to try to ram through another stimulus because they don't know anything else. I mean, these are people of stunningly limited capacity. They get up every morning, they know the answer is government, they just don't know what the question is yet. So we're going to have a three-part economic plan at American Solutions. Part one, commit to balancing the budget by cutting spending and by reforming the government. And when you start out at $4 trillion, there is a lot of stuff you can cut, and nobody who works for a living will have noticed it. So I think you start with that, and you say we're going to downsize government. We're going to pretend government's like all the businesses that have been downsizing. We're going to learn how to do it at the same level of intensity. And we did it once before with John Kasich and Bob Livingston and Bill Archer and Dick Armey. We balanced the federal budget. 4 straight years, $405 billion in debt paid off while cutting taxes for the first time in 16 years. We know this can be done. It's a historic fact. It's not a theory. Part two, a very aggressive pro-jobs and pro-business tax program. 5 simple steps. 1, 50% reduction in Social Security and Medicare tax for the next 2 years for both the employer and the employee, so every small business gets a massive windfall for liquidity without worrying about the government-run banks, and so that every working American knows that we are going to bring them an increase in take-home pay immediately. You pay for that, frankly, by taking money out of the stimulus, taking money out of TARP, selling everything you've got at General Motors, AIG, all the banks, get the government out of owning stock, and go back, and you put that in to replace the money you just took out of the Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund. That gives you a 2-year window, by the way, to then talk about serious entitlement reform, because people will now be faced with a substantial increase in their taxes if they don't reform the entitlements or a new model of the entitlements. And you'll have suddenly have the richest debate about entitlement reform in American history. Second, 100% expensing for small businesses, so that they can buy the best equipment in the world, write it off in 1 year, and American workers can be the most. And I'd probably define small businesses at around $1 billion gross sales. 3, you want to match the this is the debate we want to have. You want to match the Chinese in job creation? Let's match the Chinese capital gains tax rate. It's 0. Okay? Now, I'm ready to go everywhere in the country and debate every liberal in the country and say, hey guys, I want to match the Chinese in job creation. You want them to buy your debt. The American people ought to get to choose. You want to be with the team that wants the Chinese to own your debt, or you want to be the team that wants you to have a job beating the Chinese? And again, I'm not hostile to the Chinese. They're our competitors. You know, it's okay for us to decide we would like to win economically. I know if you're a liberal, the term win is very difficult. The term we is almost impossible. But for the other 98% of the country that goes, are you nuts? So 0 capital gains. You want American companies to compete in the world market? This is something Craig Barrett at Intel told me 2 years ago. Match the Irish corporate tax rate, 12.5%. We have the highest combined state and federal corporate tax in the world, and then we wonder why we don't do better. And then we fuss around with liberals who are mad because corporations act rationally because they flee all the bad things liberals do to them. And then we don't want to defend the corporation because they sent the job overseas, and we're not smart enough to attack the liberal for forcing them to send the job overseas. Well, I'm prepared to say, hey, I want every American company to win everywhere on the planet because that means more jobs in the U.S. Let's have a 12.5% Irish level of corporate tax rate. Finally, And again, this is an issue Republicans ought to use every single morning for the rest of their lives, because it is a 79% issue. I'm a Reaganite. Reagan was an FDR Democrat. Find 75 or 80% issues. Stand next to them and smile. Let your opponent frown. Now, what am I describing? The permanent abolishment of the death tax. The fact is, overwhelmingly, you know, rich people feel guilt-ridden and they think they shouldn't be too publicly aggressively for the death tax. Warren Buffett's so totally against it, he actually gave away billions of dollars tax-free so he wouldn't have to pay taxes on them, because he would really like to have a big tax as long as he didn't pay it. Well, that's nonsense. The average American knows it is fundamentally wrong to require you to visit the IRS and the undertaker the same week. It's that simple. And the average American believes, back to the pursuit of happiness, that if you spend your life working and saving and doing the right thing, no government should come in when you die and take it away from your family. That it's fundamentally, morally wrong. Finally, what threatens us and what do we need to do to be safe? Two things threaten us. One is the eventual potential of a Chinese hegemonic system, and frankly, the answer to that is us, not anybody else. There's nothing the Chinese are going to do in the next 40 years that we couldn't radically overmatch if we get our act together. If we go back to being an entrepreneurial, investing, working society, if we go back to being a country that actually requires you to learn before you get a diploma, if we go back to being a country that doesn't pay schools that don't teach, if we go back to being a country that decides trial lawyers are less useful than engineers, scientists, and doctors, nobody's going to catch us in the lifetime of anybody in this room, not even the lifetime of Griffin. The fact is, we're the best integrator of human talent on the planet unless we're methodically screwing ourselves up. That's called government, by the way. So if we do our job right, the Chinese aren't a problem. The only problem that is direct and a mortal threat, which the Ron Silver film alluded to, is the fact that we can't even describe the irreconcilable wing of Islam. Now, I want to say just two things on this topic, because I don't want to run that much longer, but it's really important to understand. They're very simple things. George Orwell wrote in The Politics of the English Language that if you can't describe something accurately, you can't think about it. And you can always tell when you have a bad policy because it's impossible to use language clearly to explain it. The Poles, Cliff and I are working with Dave, are developing a great new movie on John Paul II's 9-day visit to Poland in 1979, which in many ways was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire. And the Poles, in the following 10-year struggle with the Soviet dictatorship, developed the slogan, 2 + 2 = 4. I know it's bold, it's out at the edge. Partly comes from George Orwell's 1984, where the state torturer says to the innocent citizen, if we tell you the answer is 5, it's 5. If we tell you the answer is 3, it's 3. And the person being tortured is thinking, yeah, but what if it's actually 4? But it also comes from Camus' The Plague, in which Camus writes, there are times when a man will be killed for saying 2 + 2 = 4, because the authorities can't stand the truth. Now, I've been using that 2 + 2 = 4 to start the following conversation on economics. I'll just give this because it's a wonderful tool. I tell every audience, I'm going to give you half of a sentence. You give me the other half. And it's exactly like 2 + 2 = 4. If you can't afford to buy a house, what's the second half? How many of you agree if you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it? Raise your hand. I'm serious. Now think about this. For 25 years, we've lived a lie. For 25 years, the official policy of the United States has been if you can't afford to buy a house, we won't look at your credit rating, we won't require a down payment, we won't make you pay any capital, any principal for 3 years, we'll give you a below-market interest rate. You do that to one person, they go bankrupt, it's a personal tragedy. You do it to 1 million people, it's a national crisis. Yet have you heard any national political leader say, you know, the entire economic problem we've got right now is a cultural problem. We don't want to reward saving and investing. We don't want to reward working. We don't want to encourage being prudent. We don't want to tell the truth about your finances. We don't want to make you be a responsible adult. And you think you can run a country this way? So now let me apply 2 + 2 = 4 to our current problem. There's more and more evidence coming out that the deeply troubled non-Rotarian who killed a number of Americans at Fort Hood. I'm only using politically acceptable language. We realize, many of you will understand that recently when we've arrested people in Denver, Detroit, and New York, as well as the troubled person in Fort Hood, they all shared one common characteristic. They did not belong to Rotary. And so I've begun to develop a brand new profiling system built around non-Rotarians. Because I wouldn't want to have any kind of profiling system which was politically insensitive, lacked clarity, or focused in on things like, it's turning out this guy was routinely communicating with a radical cleric in Yemen. And the National Security Agency knew it. And the FBI knew it. And they were all standing around going, well, maybe it's a research project. Now, maybe before 9/11, you could say maybe it's a research project. This is madness. And now you have an Attorney General whose basic position is, let's have a public trial under American criminal defense models with their lawyers having access or demanding access or suggesting access. Frankly, somebody should introduce a resolution of impeachment. This is a... Let me try to illustrate my point, because I think it's why the concept of replace rather than reform is so important. I don't want to be told that appointing an Attorney General whose law firm was pro bono defending terrorists makes sense. I don't want to be told that when he appoints lawyers whose law firms defended terrorists pro bono, it makes sense. I don't want to be told that people who care more about the rights of terrorists than the lives of Americans should be allowed to serve in the Justice Department of the United States. One of the reasons the American people have not yet mobilized to the full power of their sovereign capacity is because they don't yet have leadership that's prepared to say, this is real. I mean, if you believe this is real, and you believe we could lose an entire city, and you believe that these people are needlessly endangering the United States, then we need to establish in the House and Senate, and we need to establish across the country, a standard of behavior which makes it clear that this is not a game, this is not politics, this is not business as usual. And I'll give you one closing example. I believe we need a profound fight about religious liberty. I believe that fight became unavoidable when the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that saying one nation under God as part of the pledge was unconstitutional. I believe it is a sign of a fascist mentality that the ACLU has filed a lawsuit about a cross in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I mean, the idea that a cross in the middle of the desert is a threat to the mindset of secular fanatics tells you almost everything you need to know. And I'm a historian, so my reaction to this is to read history. In 1802, the Jeffersonians passed the Judiciary Act of 1802. Jefferson knew a fair amount about the Constitution. Madison knew vastly more. They were both in the administration. The Judiciary Act of 1802 abolishes 18 out of 35 federal judges. Doesn't impeach them, abolishes them. Says, we're not paying you. You can't go to, there's no court. Several of them said this was inappropriate, it's a lifetime appointment. They went to the remaining 17 judges to file suit, and the remaining 17 judges said, have you lost your mind? If I accept the suit, they're going to abolish my court. This is This is, by the way, precisely what Hamilton and Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, that any time the weakest of the three branches takes on the two elected branches, if the two elected branches are serious, they will in fact guarantee the defeat of the judicial branch. Now, as many of you know, I am a moderate. So I would only propose not to abolish over half of all the judges, which is what Jefferson did. I would merely propose to abolish the Ninth Circuit and re-recruit. Because if we're serious, that's the right reaction. You show me a judge so ignorant they believe that it's unconstitutional to say one nation under God, I'll show you a judge who shouldn't be drawing money from the taxpayers. It's a very straightforward relationship. And remember, in closing, the reason I wrote a wonderful book that Gay helped inspire at Mount Vernon, To Try Men's Souls, is because we thought, when we sat down and discussed it a year and a half ago, that we would get to a point where we'd have high unemployment, foreign enemies, and a radical administration. And people would want to know, what is it Americans once did? And how is it we became American? And on Christmas Day, 1776, Washington's army had collapsed from 30,000 in Brooklyn in September to 2,500. Less than 1 out of every 1,000 Americans had the courage to be with Washington on Christmas Day. Of that 2,500, 1/3 did not have boots. They wrapped their feet in burlap and they left a trail of blood marching the 9 miles to Trenton. Washington decided to cross an icy river at night in a snowstorm, to march at night to surprise 800 professional German soldiers, win a surprise victory, capture all 800, and reestablish the legitimacy of the revolution. 2 weeks later, he had 15,000 volunteers. The password that night was victory or death. I want you to go from here, after this weekend, and look every successful person you know in the eye, and look every patriot you know in the eye, and tell them there are young men and women risking their lives all around this planet, in uniform, in the State Department, in the intelligence community, so we can be free. Don't tell me how much you've given. Don't tell me how tired you are. Don't tell me how frustrating it is. This country was created by people who are willing to say victory or death while marching in burlap bags in the middle of a snowstorm. We're going to have to find those people again. We're going to have to run people for 513,000 offices in both parties. We're going to have to isolate and crush the secular socialist left, and we're going to have to replace their failed system with systems that succeed. This is work George Washington would have approved of. And this is work you need to take seriously for the next 3 years so we can give our children and grandchildren the greatest, freest, and most prosperous country in history. Thank you very, very much.